Hello, my name is Brock Davignon, and I'm an aging past student of Ted Danielewski, who I had the good fortune in my life of knowing as a mentor, as a professor, and to some extent a friend in a wonderful sense where we could talk about ideas and what mattered. And ideas mattered a great deal to him. And I would often challenge him on what was perceived as a more than a liberal point of view, but perhaps a democratic socialist point of view. And yet he understood free market volitional contracts. He understood business. He understood how bad force was. He was under the illusion that just because you vote for force, somehow that's okay. But increasingly, as I knew him, he began to evolve to some extent, maybe because of me, I don't know. And one great example of how dramatic form, and to some extent what's novel and new in entertainment, or even comedy, can affect commercial and industrial films, occurred in 1977. There was another film professor besides Tad, whose name was Irwin Goodman. And he had learned from Tad to get real Hollywood people on a plane and up to BYU. And I was taking a one-credit class from Goodman, but I had this relationship on the side with Tad, whether I was taking courses from him or not, because I was computerizing at the studio. And I was developing or had developed an interest in raster and vector graphics and computer graphics special effects. And the place wasn't particularly designed for that. It was very much a film studio in the traditional Hollywood film sense, but the television part of the communications college was very advanced. It had a trailer that was, Olympic quality mobile studio for football games and basketball games and so forth for KBYU Sports. And I worked on the newsroom. And I was very much interested in my career as a cause marketer for the concept of freedom. And I studied this, and there was a fellow off campus named Cloyd Bird, who family typed a lot of, as his wife Sharon typed a lot of papers, and he would occasionally run across students who seemed to have a flair for freedom and economics in particular. He was an insurance man, and we hit it off. He was what you would call an activist libertarian with a small L. He wasn't a political libertarian. But he taught students for a fee about various things. And he was one of the primary exponents of the American Economic Foundation's formula that went humans' material welfare equals natural resources plus human energy and education multiplied by tools, tool providers. Now, we got into some interesting discussions on why he didn't want to stay in Poland and have the Soviet Union be in charge of Poland. And one of these things was that I pointed out to him that in any economic system, tools are provided by somebody. Now, whether that's by force of a collective or tacit permission or full permission, as in a stockholder, which is a tool provider, and they're saving up what they do voluntarily to, instead of take a vacation, hand you a hammer, and you build something with it. The value of the hammer goes up because your houses are successful, and then you can sell the certificate you had for that hammer at a higher rate. Now, if I just wanted to get my money back for the hammer, plus a little bit, it would, if it's a nickel out of every dollar that I'm going to get paid back, it would take 20 years to, get paid back my nickel. But if it's the value of the tool rises in the hands of a skilled carpenter or workman, well, you get a opportunity to increase the value of the act of providing tools. So he understood this, and Irwin Goodman had invited Bill Birch, B-U-R-C-H, who is the vice president of Universal Studios Commercial and Industrial Films, to help team teach a one-credit class. Basically met once a week, and Birch would fly up from Universal Studios to BYU and would teach a class on contract making and so forth. But one class period, he issued a challenge to us. He had a $350,000 budget for a 75th anniversary film for the Ford Motor Company. There was plenty of stock footage on this, but he didn't really have a theme, and he challenged us as students to have a theme. So I said, before you commit on anything, I have a good theme for you. By next week, I'll have it ready for you. And I did. And basically, it was 75th anniversary of tool providers for the Ford Motor Company. And Henry Ford had tried 3 times at companies, and only the 3rd time was a success. He had seen a piece of metal fall off of a car on a racetrack in Corona, California, I believe it was. And the thing cling clang, he said, "What is this?" to the German team. He ran out on the racetrack and retrieved it. And he said, well, we couldn't find a steel maker, so we went to a glass maker, and they used vanadium in the making of glass, and the vanadium and the carbon mixed with the steel and made it very, very hard. And instantly Ford knew what he wanted to do with it. That was make a solid engine block, where before they were jigsaw puzzles, and they'd get loose and fire would squirt out the sides and the engine would burn up a middle-class person's entire annual salary and equivalent. And they'd still be in debt for a burned-up car. He also had the solid head on a solid engine block, and then he knew that the teeth on a transmission wouldn't bust off if you hit the wrong gear or even reverse. In fact, you stopped a Model T Ford by throwing it into reverse. You didn't have brakes. And he was very chintzy on taillights too. So anyway, Ford sold millions of these cars in his early days, and the Lincoln Highway, he finally consented to throw in $1 million of $5 subscriptions along with Edison to make the Lincoln Highway from New York Times Square to San Francisco's Lincoln Park in the west. And that mostly today is known as I-80, but then it was a research and development highway paid for by voluntary things, not bonds, not forcing 49% of the people to pay what 51% do in buying these bonds back years later, but full voluntary ways to deal with common area management. So Edison had kicked in his million. He asked Henry Ford, how would you like to join us on this? And he goes, well, I don't know, Tom. I would that would make us responsible for the roads. And Edison says, is that a bad thing? But in fact, it was a popular movement of thousands and thousands of people. And other people built roads from Merced into Yosemite because they'd used the tourism as a draw, and then they'd spend the money on the city folk with bonds. And 1910 was 12 million, 1912 was 40 million. And this was indebting future taxpayers for these roads. And so I had a clear understanding of this. I talked this stuff conceptually over with Tad. And we'd sort of humor each other and agree to disagree on things. And I had taken a long time to get through college because I'd stopped out for like 2 years and created in 1972 through 4 the very first van transportation system for blind, handicapped, and elderly, using percentages you earn, finance, and an econometrically averaged as the crow fly routes for a driver to put a 1 mile string on a map and see how far it is for you from point A to point B, but there might be several other people in the van, and if they didn't have a specific dental appointment, it was the most economical route around to the grocery stores and to doctor's offices and so forth. And I got turned down 52 times for capital and about 51 times for insurance, including by Lloyd's of London. And eventually I got the insurance from Quinlan Insurance and got a capital offer of $200,000 for some van units, including Motorola base stations and other innovations, ramps that went down from the sides, or like Take Me to Your Leader, like Robert Wise's sorts of movies, in the day the earth stood still. And so all this was, these conversations with Tad were happening. So meanwhile, I'm taking this class with Irwin Goodman. And so I ran by my script for this, short movie that showed that land is a tool. Ford factories don't float in the air. And the process of what is a tool provider, what is a stockholder. And I don't know if anybody's ever addressed stockholders this way, but the American Economic Foundation had done some successful economic understanding, and it was founded by a guy named Clark and Reminowski, two guys, that on radio listened to the way people really talked about economics. And in 1949, they fought President Truman's nationalization of the steel mills simply because it had a lot of defense money going into them, but they were a contractor to Uncle Sam. And so they stopped that nationalization, and things like Bethlehem Steel and United States Steel remained independent. Orem, Utah had a steel plant in it. So some of these things were of interest. And so two major things happened out of this. One, Bill Birch liked what he saw with the formula and the examples. And he says, well, I can't pay you for this or give you a credit. According to my contract, I'm supposed to make this thing. And I'm like, okay. And I said, he says, tell you what, I'll trade you a favor that I will put you in front of the board of directors of Universal Studios if I can have this script. And I thought about it for about a second and a half, and I stuck out my head, and I said, you got a deal. And so he took it. And he also rewrote it into the Incredible Ford Factory Tour, which ran for 5 years as an ad campaign, PR campaign for Ford. In that time, Ford's investment in stocks, telling this story, was increased 3 full times, and for the first time in 80 years, Ford became the same size as General Motors. People looked at this formula, and they looked at they had this understandable operating report I used that for Ford that showed the number of stacks of pennies, and it's 51 cents for basically supplies. It's 37 cents for labor, not 2 cents, 37 cents. There is 9 cents for payments ordered by government, and then it diminished down to tools wearing out 7 cents, and then it got down to maybe 5 cents, and you divide that in two for retained earnings, so you might buy some more real estate to stick a factory on or something, and just 2 cents would go to those greedy stockholders. Now when you explain a heavy industrial company's affairs this way, all of a sudden, squirrely faces from public schools crinkle up, and they go, well, where's the greedy capitalists? I mean, the laborers are getting most of this, and the tool providers for them are only getting 2 pennies? Yeah, so Ford was perceived as undervalued by stockholders, so they bought Ford stock, give them the tools they need, and up they'll go. Especially since K-forms, and inflation at this time was running at 21% a year. And in one of my other classes, I was being trained to do annual reports. And they were off by 21%, 17% every year that President Carter was in there, handling the inflation from LBJ and Nixon, plus his own Glorioski stuff. So what happened was that the money was being diluted tremendously. So what people got interested in real value. I wrote the National Accounting Standards Board at the encouragement of Ted. He says, well, yeah, that seems a little dishonest. You can't make a decision if your profit's 2% of things and your, figures are off by 20%. It paralyzes decision making. So Reagan said he'd stop the presses, and that was one of the reasons he was elected. Ted thought it the other two. And I was reflecting on this, and that it was successful, and communicating in simple to understand terms, like inflation is 80-cent dollars handed to banks by the Treasury through the Federal Reserve, and they lend it out at 100 cents. That means you can absorb 20% losses and throw all sorts of people out on the street and repossess their stuff, all by legalized theft. And so that's the perception of what capitalism is, but that's a mixture of state, police power, and business that should not be. So if you have a percentage of income thing, kind of like stock holding, in a person's income that they've pledged for college education, medical care, a car, a house. These percentages of income add up. So I had these discussions with Ted, and he was aware of the LDS Church's welfare workfare system, and had done some work with a fellow who had built Welfare Square to explain to President Reagan exactly these same things in secular terms. So in doing so, I was watching this success go on, and I'd left college again for a couple of years in California, came back and finished up in 82 through 84, and mostly 83 and 84. And my first stop, of course, was Ted. So he was telling me the success that Birch was having and so forth. And he says, you really ought to collect on this favor. And in 1980, I had been programming a trash company, the first trash company to be programmed. There was a fellow there named Frank Noble who had this Rube Goldberg contraption kind of mind for separating out different colors of glass and other items for recycling, which became a good part of the business, and some other innovations. And during lunch, he and I would talk. And we did, with his teenage sons, a survey of what young people were interested in. I wasn't so far from a young person. And so we concluded what their interests were in gaming, whether it was strategic gaming, fantasy gaming, cosplay, part of all of this. In the emerging computer games from '77, which I had sold, instead of zero-sum games, there was economics involved in SimCity. You have to build things and grow food, and if you wish to use it up in some way, like some stupid war, you could do that. So we came up with a 60-question test of some young people who rented out the Sheraton Hotel across from Disneyland and played war games in it. They called those strategicons. If they were fantasy games alternating other months, those were orc cons. So we surveyed these people in some interesting costumes, and had a little egg on the table with a diamond on it, and Frank, who looked like God himself and had a purple cape on, would say, the kid would ask, what's that? All the other vendor tables are crowded with stuff. Here's just this egg. And he says, well, that's a grimoflexer. The world will be grimoflexed if you don't answer these 60 questions here about what kind of video gaming and movies you'd like to see. And so the kid would dutifully fill out all 60 questions, so the world would not be grimoflexed. And so we compiled these up, and we began to realize certain participatory entertainment events would be very successful for, yes, Universal Studios. A friend of mine in 1959, I'd gotten to know later, had been responsible for the tram aspect of it. But it basically looked at a hunk of metal like Charlton Heston had been in for Gray Lady Down. You'd see a game show for half an hour, and you'd stop and look at Bing Crosby's gold record for White Christmas. And that was the tour. And they got the red seat apart across the pool for them. And so we came up with 210 ideas for participatory entertainment based on types of genres of movies like westerns or whatever. Things like Future World were out there. But the idea of participatory entertainment, they had a $60,000 rental of Lum's Restaurant for a 3-day sex orgy apparently at Universal. So apparently some of these executives knew something about participatory entertainment. And so I said, I'm going to collect on this favor. So we'd put all this material together from about 80 to 82, and I was back with Tad in 83. And so I was going down to California, and I asked Bill Birch to collect on this thing. So he said, well, I'll be your champion and I'll submit it. What I didn't know is he was about to retire. So there was no way he could protect us, and all of this was on handshake deals, which is another lesson I learned, that if you're going to hand it to a group of entities that are likely to steal something and allegedly improve it, okay. But about halfway through the process, we saw that we weren't being in the loop, so we clammed up, and they never got the other half. However, the ideas that they did use in the emphasis on science fiction movies and so forth, and getting people involved in stunts and falling off, tall things into big, airbags and so forth. All of these things, from lightsabers and on, managed to turn Universal Studios tours in among the top 50 tourist destinations. And that includes natural wonders and man-made things. 2 of the Universal Studios tours of the 5 they have were in that top 50. And of course, I've never seen a nickel for any of this, but I have become something of an aficionado on tourist venues and environmental prototype intentional community, somewhat analogous to Walt Disney's Epcot's, from a book of another mentor of mine named Spencer McCallum, who wrote a book called The Art of Community, which was about leaseholds and purchasing in co-ops, like many farmers share the cost of tractors and silos and so forth, and putting it on a percentage as you earn finance and find insurance basis. So, having the world all figured out, at this somewhat early age, much of my efforts in life have been to research and advance this in a lot of fields. Today, reinsurance companies have assets of $470 trillion, at the sign of the T, as Mr. Ford would say, which is as much money as the U.S. federal government is in debt. They handle natural disasters. If your local insurance company is wiped out by an earthquake, a flood, a hurricane, tsunami, these 30 to 50% of stupidly rigid installment payment retail premiums go to the reinsurer to protect an area. And Katrina, when that hit, for instance, the politicians promised the local people $100 billion. However, those people that had property casualty insurance for wind and water damage, the retailers who were going broke and knew it said, well, that wind damage is really water damage, and that water damage is really wind damage. And the reinsurers got mad at them and says, you're embarrassing the whole concept of risk gambling here. Just tell the people they're going to get their money in about 6 weeks. And they'd hired some physicists to do chaos theory to move money around the world quickly. And sure enough, in 6 weeks, there was $36 billion of checks being written in New Orleans. And I began to learn about some of these things because of Tad's challenges ideologically. Oh, how do you care about this? How do you care about that? I'm a caring person, so I figured this out over time. And the echoes of Tad's challenges still are happening today. So we're implementing this with intentional communities in a proposal for Utah, interestingly enough, called the PAVANT, P-A-H-V-A-N-T, Water and Land Development Consortium. And it involves private property co-ops to grow food in Utah, which is otherwise a desert, because all they otherwise grow is cattle and alfalfa, and you can't eat much of that. If the trucks stop, or there's a train strike, of which there's been about 4 this year, or there's a diesel oil shortage for trucks right now. So what are these people in Utah going to do? Walk out of their cities to where? Arizona? So solving problems in advance was something that Ted taught me, which I think he got from his brigade blowing up Nazi trains and getting away. It takes a little prep. But this man's material welfare was of great interest to Ted, and he thought the ultimate victory would be to persuade the bad guys that there's a better way of making money than stealing it. And that goes for all politicians. And so increasingly he began to talk like this to me. And I appreciated that greatly. He was sort of a laboratory for me to see the power of volitional science versus social science. And to whatever extent he took some of those ideas to USC and Hollywood, I do not know. He taught down there, and my life was busy in other ways after that, across the country doing research on this very topic of percentages you earn. And we lost contact, and I regret that greatly. But his style of real client project-based learning, Erwin Goodman took to heart. Bill Birch, as a CEO, responsible for 55% of the revenue of Universal at the time, agreed with that and said, yeah, I'll invest some time in kids in a plane trip, doing this weekly. And that was the result of it. So dramatic form and participatory entertainment, you can look at San Diego for Comic-Con, there's 300,000 people that show up there dressed in costumes with their favorite hero or villain, all playing out dramatic form in one or the other. The Burning Man, there's a lot of these venues around. Historical reenactments have gotten popular. And there's very little media covering them. So as far as people asking questions, well, gee, how do I invest $3,000 in this costume from Name the War? These are things they do. But the constructive endeavors of mankind were always of greater interest to Tad Danielewski, Cloyd Bird, and Erwin Goodman. And so they seem to be proud of me as a student for pushing things in this way. And in 1984, Tad advised me a bit. I had a public relations senior project to do. And I had invited a bunch of libertarians from General Motors, Hovercraft Division, and Bob Hula, Reason Magazine, Dana Rohrabacher, who I mentioned earlier, was a speechwriter for Reagan, and some of the founders of the SIL, Don Ernstberger. And these were speakers of the 13 colleges of BYU. And there were others who were into Latter-day Saint missionary work, trying to calculate when Latter-day Saints would persuade the world to all be Latter-day Saints. 274 years, by the way. And a whole variety of ideas. And one of those people was Robert Jarvik, who at the time was inventing and having success at building the artificial heart. And he explained that he had not wanted to ask for grants or tax money. And he got $750,000 worth of investment. Multiply that by 7 as far as the dilution of the money supply today. And his stock bought him the tools to make tickers and make better tickers and better ones. And he's working on cochlear ear implants these days. But he explained how he didn't like pleading need and had an idea that people might want. And Philo Farnsworth, with the young inventor of television, is the same way. And so it isn't just needs analysis and scarcity by the government. And Tad, who had lived in a very hard scrabble economic basis and then a war hitting and trying to kill a large number of its citizens, he recognized the value of tools, whether it was dynamite or a computer program or a camera. And he much favored that if you can prevent disasters, by agreements and handshakes, kisses, and contracts, as he said. A line I still use to this day in trying to decide at what level I need to trust somebody. We can probably bring peace and freedom to the world. And that was Ted's conclusion. And I said, well, I'll work on that. And so I'm still working at it. And Carlos Ruiz had told me that he'd researched that Irwin Goodman had passed away about 1997. And I keep thinking I'm going to help on the BYU Alumni Association find some other students of TAD. And we can compare notes before we fall over. But many of us have had a tremendously rich life because we knew and interacted with the great brain of Ted Danielewski, and a good heart and good morals, ethics, and values. And you can't say much more than that about the man, that he's affected many of us and will continue to affect the world for the better. So thank you for this opportunity to talk about Tad and how he has affected the real world with dramatic form, and a few laughs. Thank you.